Did you know Canada had its own prohibition? It wasn't just an American story. So, why did Canada go dry? And how did it lead to the liquor laws we have today? During World War I, a powerful temperance movement swept the nation, arguing that grain should be used for food, not booze. By 1918, most of Canada was under a federal ban on alcohol. But when the war ended, the provinces took over, and things got interesting. With the US still dry, Canada became a smuggler's paradise. Rum runners raced across the Great Lakes, supplying American speakeasies. But back home, the bans weren't working. Illegal bars popped up everywhere, and enforcement was a nightmare. Eventually, the public and governments realized that control, not a complete ban, was the answer. They created government liquor boards, like the LCBO, which still regulate alcohol sales today. So, Canada's brief dry spell didn't just fail, it created the very system we live with now. Pretty wild, right? Thanks for watching. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we'll be diving into a fascinating and often overlooked chapter of Canadian history, our very own Prohibition Era. You've probably heard all about the Roaring Twenties and the speakeasies in the United States, but did you know that Canada had its own wild ride with banning booze? It's a story of good intentions, unexpected consequences, and a legacy that still shapes how Canadians buy alcohol today. So, why did Canada go dry in the first place? It wasn't a single, nationwide decision like in the US. Instead, it was a slow burn, fanned by the flames of the temperance movement. For decades leading up to the early 20th century, groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union had been campaigning hard. They saw alcohol as the root of society's biggest problems: poverty, crime, and domestic abuse. They argued that a sober nation would be a more productive, moral, and prosperous one. Their message gained serious traction during the First World War. The argument shifted to patriotism. How could we justify using precious grain for brewing beer and distilling whiskey when our soldiers needed bread and our allies needed food? It was framed as a patriotic sacrifice for the war effort. This powerful combination of moral fervor and wartime duty was the final push needed. Starting in 1916, one by one, every province except Quebec voted to ban the sale of alcohol. By 1918, the Federal Ordering Council made it illegal to manufacture, import, and transport liquor anywhere in the country. Canada was officially, almost entirely, dry. Of course, the goal was to stop people from drinking. But the reality, it just changed how and what they drank. The laws were a patchwork of provincial rules and federal oversights, riddled with loopholes you could drive a truck or a boat through. For instance, while you couldn't buy a drink at a bar, doctors could still prescribe alcohol for medicinal purposes. Suddenly, all sorts of common ailments required a prescription for a bottle of whiskey or brandy. Pharmacies became the new, legal, and very busy liquor vendors. And then there was the big one. While provinces banned the sale of alcohol, they couldn't stop its production for export. This created a bizarre situation. Distilleries and breweries, like the ones run by the powerful Bronfman and Seagram families, could legally produce massive quantities of liquor, as long as it was destined for a foreign country. This legal loophole turned Canada into the perfect supplier for its southern neighbor when American Prohibition kicked in 1920. This set the stage for the legendary era of rum running. The 5,500-mile border between Canada and the United States became the world's longest, leakiest. On the east coast, schooners loaded with alcohol would leave Nova Scotia and meet American speedboats in international waters, a route famously known as the Rum Row. On the west coast, boats would slip out of Vancouver, bound for Washington and California. But the real heart of the action was the Great Lakes, particularly the Detroit River, a narrow channel separating Windsor, Ontario, from Detroit, Michigan. This stretch of water became a superhighway for smuggled booze. In the summer, fast boats called scows would zip across the river, often under the cover of darkness. In the winter, when the river froze solid, they just drove cars and heavily laden sleighs across the ice. It was a risky business, but incredibly profitable. Figures like Al Capone were major customers, and Canadian towns like Windsor became boomtowns, their economies fueled by the illicit cross-border trade. The profits were staggering, and it created a new class of wealthy, powerful smugglers. But it also brought a wave of crime and corruption. Gangsters fought for control of smuggling routes, leading to violence. Bribes were commonplace, as smugglers paid off police and customs officials to look the other way. The very law designed to create a more orderly society was, in many ways, fostering a culture of lawlessness. Back home in Canada, while the export business was booming, a thriving underground scene was emerging. The desire for a drink didn't just disappear. Speakeasies, known as blind pigs or boozicans, popped up in the back rooms of restaurants, in basements, and in private homes. To get in, you'd need a password or a connection. Inside, you could find music, dancing, and, of course, illegally sold alcohol. It was often of questionable quality, sometimes dangerously so, but it was a place for people to socialize and defy the law. The enforcement of prohibition was a massive challenge. With thousands of miles of border and coastline to patrol, and a public that was often uncooperative, police and customs agents were overwhelmed. The resources just weren't there. For every rum runner they caught, dozens more would get through. The sheer scale of the illegal trade made a mockery of the law. As the 1920s wore on, public opinion began to turn. The initial enthusiasm for prohibition was fading fast. People saw the rise in organized crime, the widespread corruption, and the hypocrisy of it all. They also saw that governments were losing out on a massive source of tax revenue. All that money from alcohol sales was now lining the pockets of criminals instead of funding public services like schools and hospitals. The economic argument became impossible to ignore. Provincial governments, facing growing debts, started to look for a way out. They needed a new system that would allow them to control the sale of alcohol and, more importantly, tax it. Quebec had already shown a different path. It had rejected total prohibition in favor of a government-run system, establishing a commission in 1921 to manage the sale of wine and spirits. It was a model of moderation and control, and it was generating a lot of money for the province. Other provinces started to take notice. Starting with British Columbia in 1921, the provinces began to repeal their prohibition laws one by one. But they didn't go back to the old system of private saloons. Instead, they adopted the Quebec model, creating provincial liquor control boards. This was the Great Canadian Compromise. The government would become the sole legal vendor of alcohol. This allowed them to regulate who could buy it, where it could be sold, and what hours it could be sold. Most importantly, it allowed them to collect taxes on every single bottle. By 1930, all provinces had abandoned total prohibition, with Prince Edward Island being the last holdout until 1948. So, what is the legacy of Canada's prohibition? It's something we live with every single day. If you've ever wondered why you have to go to a special government-run store like the LCBO in Ontario, the SAQ in Quebec, or BC liquor stores to buy your spirits, you're looking at the direct result of the Prohibition Era. These government monopolies were created to replace the ban, offering control and revenue as an alternative to the chaos of both the old saloon system and the illegal trade. It fundamentally reshaped our relationship with alcohol, turning it from a simple commodity into a heavily regulated substance. It also inadvertently helped build massive fortunes and iconic Canadian companies, like Seagram's, which became one of the largest spirits companies in the world thanks to its perfectly legal and perfectly timed production during American Prohibition. The story of Canadian Prohibition is a classic tale of unintended consequences. It was a grand social experiment that aimed to create a better, more moral society. Instead, it fueled organized crime, created a culture of defiance, and ultimately failed. But in its failure, it created the unique system of alcohol regulation that defines Canada today, a lasting echo of that wild, dry, and very complicated time. Thanks so much for watching. What do you think? Was Prohibition a noble failure or a complete disaster? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this trip into Canadian history, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories. See you next time.